Hi, Bio4, and welcome to part 5. We just finished heart sounds, the lub-dub, which has to do with the valves. And now we're going to move on to the electrical activity of the heart. So this isn't mechanical, this is what are the action potentials that are happening here for that electricity to travel through the heart and then result in a contraction. Right? We need to contract and eject blood, contract and eject blood. So it's that electrical activity that we want to look at. And so what it has is a pathway of electrical cells. So the majority of the cells in the heart are contractile cells, they're the ones that know how to contract. But 1% of these are cells that don't really contract very well. What they do is they send action potentials, and they're distributed throughout the heart so that it has a roadway that it can follow, a path. So you need to know the path and the names of those. So in the right atrium here, there is one very important region here, and it's called the sinoatrial node. It's the true pacemaker of the heart, and it's often referred to as the SA node, sinoatrial node, and that's kind of the boss. That's the boss. That's the one that's going to send an action potential over to the other atrium, and they're going to pretty much, it's going to result in a contraction that's almost simultaneous, right? The right and the left side of the heart, maybe slightly off, in milliseconds off, but there's enough electricity there that's sort of jumping out of the sinoatrial node like this through gap junctions. Remember, they can connect electrically so that both right atrium and left atrium are going to be depolarized. And what that does is it's like a spark. It's going to create a spark that allows other cells to then generate their own spark. So the first spark is going to hit here, the second node, and that's called the atrioventricular node. It's a good word for it because it goes from the atrium to the ventricle. And that one is going to be responsible for taking that roadway, that path, all the way down to the ventricle, because so far we've only achieved depolarization of the atria. Okay, so imagine one of those action potentials hits the atrioventricular node, and the atrioventricular node now can, through its cells, side by side, those gaptions, travel zap, 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 all the way down here. And it's going to go to something called the atrioventricular bundle, right? It's kind of like a stem of a tree here that is later going to branch. So that atrioventricular bundle turns into the bundle branches. So there's one branch and there's the other because you need to have one go right and one go left. So those are called the bundle branches. Once they reach the very bottom of the heart, they're going to actually do this loopy thing where they go and depolarize, look, all this different area, but also sort of climb up the outside here. And notice that it's doing it from low to high because you need to contract from low to high in that order. Why? Because the vessels that are going to, have blood coming out of them are up at the top. So you're going to have to squeeze from below. It's like squeezing a water balloon. You don't squeeze it from the opening, you squeeze it from the bottom. So you squeeze it from the bottom and blood can go out the top. So that organization is important, that it goes from SA node to AV node down to the atrioventricular bundle, to the bundle branches, because it's just branched out. And look, there's lots of branching that goes on here. And then all the way up the outside of the ventricle. In other words, we're going to squeeze. The outcome of that is to squeeze this and eject blood. So coming up the sides are called the Purkinje fibers, discovered by Mr. Purkinje, I guess, gave them his name. So also on this side would be Purkinje fibers because it's coming up that side of the heart. So that is the 1% cells that are really good at doing that one thing, which is spreading electrical activity. And what happens if you didn't have that electrical activity? Well, then the other 99% of the cells that are contractile cells don't get the message to contract. So it's a problem, right? Terrible problem. Now, if you had a problem with this electrical activity in that, for example, the sinoatrial node isn't working well, or they all start, instead of to follow the leader, alpha leader here, the leader is a sinoatrial node. If they decide to not follow the leader and all of them start to send their own signals willy-nilly, what do you have other than a problem? Fibrillation. So a defibrillator is an apparatus that gives you a big shock, kind of resetting all these guys so that they pay attention at once again to the SA node, to the sinoatrial node, because that's how this heart is going to work. And it's going to go lub-dub, 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 lub-dub. But if not, if they're all deciding to do their own thing, we're in trouble. So that does not work. Okay. Some interesting facts. The average heart rate is about 72 beats per minute. When we talk about depolarization, we're talking about the electrical activity that's going to generate a contraction. And it's written out for you, the order. And so you can look at it here as you look at the slides again to study. AV node, bundle. The AV bundle is often called bundle of His also. It's a different word for it. Bundle of His, and then branches, bundle branches, and then Purkinje fibers. And the outcome is that ejection, the ventricles contract. Very interesting is that there are some artificial pacemakers, because if an individual starts to have lots of trouble with this electrical activity, then you can actually, with a battery and some wiring, have an artificial pacemaker that sets its own pace. So you know that that pace is going to come, and you don't have to wait for some delayed electrical activity from the heart, which could make a person pass out, for example. So there's a couple different kinds. I'm just showing these two more common ones, which is a demand pacing, in which case it only stimulates if needed. So it's like a little computer. It can tell that if that electrical activity is too low or it skipped a beat, it's going to jump in. So it's on demand. And then the rate responsive, which is the one that's just going to give it out at a steady pace, and you know that you have that electrical activity happening. It's super interesting. We had a cadaver one year that had a pacemaker, and we just followed the wire down into the ventricle, and there it was. Instead of I expected to be sort of in the right atria, but it wasn't. It was down the ventricle, and that was enough to sort of stimulate that muscle to eject. And there was nothing, like no fibrous tissue around it. It was perfectly clean and just sort of sitting there inside the ventricle. I don't know why that really surprised me so much. So here's a picture. You would have this just under your skin, and then the electrodes are going to be fed here through the vein, and then it's going to just sit here. This is exactly what it looked like. It just sits in that ventricle, and because of the battery here, it's just going to zap it at that interval that's needed for your body. This is a double lead and the single lead. It doesn't really matter. I just want you to have the general idea of that electrode sitting at the bottom of your ventricle. In the rate responsive, it's interesting because they've gotten so sophisticated that now if you were to go out running or you're on a treadmill and you have greater need for oxygen, it would actually speed up and know how to speed up that heart rate. And then when you step off it, to slow it back down again. So you're going to get monitoring of oxygen levels, temperature of blood, and all whatever factors are contributing to your activity. So they're amazing. It's definitely a computer. The other very interesting thing is that now if you live in a big city and you're near a cardiac center, you can actually hold your phone up on to the inserted apparatuses just under your skin, and put your, with an app, put it up to the pacemaker, and it can send a message relating how much battery is left in the monitor, and whether you need to come in or not to have a battery replaced. So interesting. What other things can go wrong? Mitral valve prolapse is something when the mitral valves don't quite meet. Do you notice you have this going on and the other one's slightly off? So there is plenty of space there in between for blood to be able to ooze out. So I'm going to do it in black here, so it could be just coming out here and returning back to the atria, and that would be a murmur. Because this didn't close correctly. This should have been like that. So some of the solutions are to put in an artificial replacement valve, and this is really nice to see the door that opens one way. Do you notice how this can come in? Blood can go that way, but when it comes this way, it crashes and shuts the door, and blood cannot go out. So that would be a titanium artificial replacement valve. They're also made porcine. They're also made out of pig valves. That works too, and there's very little rejection. Okay, so we're going to cut right now and continue on in the next video. Thank you all. Bye.